Victoria Sterling watched from her $5 million Manhattan penthouse as her 6-year-old daughter Grace sat mute in the building's courtyard below. She had been silent for 8 months, ever since her father left with his secretary, leaving behind a void that even the most expensive toys couldn't fill. The best child psychologists in New York hadn't been able to get her to say a single word. Then he arrived, Marcus Washington, 40 years old, the building's janitor with the most genuine smile Victoria had ever seen. While collecting garbage, he noticed Grace sitting alone and began telling her about his day, the stray cats he fed, the funny stories that happened while working. Victoria was about to go down and stop this stranger, but froze when the impossible happened. Grace smiled. For the first time in 8 months, her daughter had reacted to someone. And when Marcus returned the next day, the miracle occurred that the $500 an hour doctors couldn't create. Grace spoke her first word. But what Victoria didn't know was that Marcus was hiding a secret that would change their lives forever. Victoria Sterling's penthouse dominated Manhattan's Upper East Side like a glass and steel fortress. Through the enormous panoramic windows, the city pulsed with life, but inside those luxurious walls reigned a devastating silence. Grace, barely 6 years old, hadn't spoken a word in 8 months, not since that cursed day when she watched her father load suitcases and leave with Sarah, his 25-year-old former secretary. Victoria possessed everything money could buy. A pharmaceutical empire inherited from her father worth $200 million, a collection of sports cars in the underground garage, closets filled with designer fashion. But all this luxury couldn't break the barrier of silence that surrounded her daughter like an invisible prison. The little girl spent her days sitting in the elegant, minimalist living room, surrounded by expensive toys she never touched. Her enormous brown eyes observed the world with a sadness that broke hearts. Victoria had consulted the best specialists in New York, child neuropsychiatrists, speech therapists, even a communication guru flown in from California. All had diagnosed selective post-traumatic mutism, but none had managed to get her to say even one word. Every morning at 7, Victoria watched from the window as the neighborhood's routine awakened. Managers in suits rushing to their BMWs, elegant women walking purebred dogs, children accompanied by nannies to expensive private schools. But her attention was always captured by one particular figure, a man in an orange uniform who cleaned the streets with a dedication that seemed almost artistic. Marcus Washington was 40 years old but looked younger, thanks to that spontaneous smile that lit up his face, even on the grayest days. 6 feet tall, lean physique, sculpted by physical work, graying hair always slightly tousled by the wind. What struck most were his eyes, warm brown like coffee, full of a vitality that Victoria hadn't seen in years in the circles she frequented. Marcus had worked in the neighborhood for 3 years, but Victoria had never paid attention until a few weeks before. She had noticed him helping an elderly lady with grocery bags, then petting a stray cat. There was something about his naturalness that intrigued her. In a world made of calculations and strategies, Marcus seemed to move following only his heart's instinct. That October morning, while Victoria prepared the breakfast that Grace would eat in silence, she noticed something different. Her daughter wasn't on the couch as usual, but pressed her little face against the window overlooking the building's courtyard. Following her gaze, Victoria saw Marcus, who had just finished emptying the dumpsters and was collecting dry leaves fallen from the trees. Marcus looked up toward the building and noticed Grace at the window. Instead of looking away like anyone else would have done, he smiled and gave her a small wave. Grace didn't respond, but her body stiffened slightly, a sign that she had noticed the attention. Victoria was about to move the child away from the window when something unexpected happened. Marcus approached the building and began miming a funny scene. He pretended to talk to the courtyard cats, made silly faces while collecting garbage, acted like an improvised clown for the girl watching from above. For the first time in 8 months, Victoria saw something she had almost forgotten existed. A hint of smile on Grace's lips. It was barely perceptible, fleeting as a butterfly's wing beat, but it was there. Her daughter had reacted to someone after months of complete indifference. Marcus finished his little performance with a theatrical bow, waved to Grace again, and walked away, pushing his cart. Grace remained at the window for 10 more minutes, staring at the spot where he had disappeared, as if hoping to see him return. That evening, for the first time in months, Grace ate all her dinner without Victoria having to insist. She didn't speak words, but her eyes seemed less dull, as if a small spark of curiosity had reignited. Victoria spent the night awake, thinking about the morning scene. An unknown janitor had managed to achieve in 5 minutes what the best specialists hadn't accomplished in 8 months. He had made her daughter smile. The second day, Marcus arrived punctually as always at 8 in the morning, but this time he immediately noticed the child at the window. Grace was already there waiting, pressed against the glass with an expectation that Victoria hadn't seen in months. Marcus smiled at her and began telling his day aloud, gesticulating as if talking to a friend. Victoria, hidden behind the curtains, listened to every word. Marcus told about finding an abandoned kitten near the dumpsters, how he had taken it to the neighborhood vet, how sweet it was to see it play with the other stray cats he fed every evening. His voice had a hypnotic quality, warm, sincere, full of lived experience. Grace hung on his every word. The child had tilted her head toward the glass, as if wanting to hear better. Her little hands were pressed against the window, and, for the first time in months, her face expressed interest in something other than emptiness. Marcus continued for 20 minutes, telling stories of the neighborhood, the residents he met every day, the small dramas and small joys of the community. When he finished his round, he stopped under Grace's window and made her a promise that made Victoria hold her breath. The next day, the story became more elaborate. Marcus transformed garbage collection into an epic adventure, using dumpsters and brooms as scenery. He told about Whiskers, an orphaned kitten who had saved his adoptive family from a big stray dog using cunning and courage instead of strength. Grace followed every movement, completely entranced. When Marcus reached the climactic moment of the story, the child opened the window to hear better. It was the first time in 8 months that she showed initiative for something. Marcus looked directly toward Grace as he concluded the story, speaking about the courage to find one's voice when loved ones need help. They were words calibrated with surgical precision, touching Grace's problem without ever pressuring or judging her. When Marcus finished the story and prepared to leave, the miracle Victoria had been waiting for 8 months happened. Grace opened her mouth and, with a small but clear voice, whispered the word that changed everything. "Thank you." Victoria began crying uncontrollably, 8 months of anguish and hope exploding in a river of liberating tears. Marcus looked up, smiled the sweetest smile in the world, and simply responded, promising to return the next day with a new adventure. Grace nodded vigorously, and for the first time in 8 months, Victoria saw her daughter behave like a normal child again. In the following days, a routine was established that became the most important moment of the day for Grace. Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, she was at the window, waiting for Marcus with growing excitement. The child's words gradually increased, first only thanks and greetings, then small phrases, curious questions about cats and stories. Victoria documented every progress with a researcher's precision, incredulous at witnessing a transformation that the most expensive specialists hadn't been able to trigger. Marcus seemed to possess a natural talent for communicating with children. He never spoke condescendingly, never asked invasive questions, never forced answers. He simply told his life, letting Grace feel free to participate when she wanted. One morning, Victoria made a decision that both terrified and excited her. She went down to the courtyard during Marcus's time. She wanted to meet the man who was bringing her daughter back to life, look him in the eyes, and understand if he was really everything he seemed. When Marcus saw her exit the building, he stopped storytelling and straightened up, suddenly aware of being closely observed. Victoria approached with the natural elegance of someone used to commanding, but also with a vulnerability in her eyes that Marcus immediately noticed. She was even more beautiful up close than she had seemed from the street. Black hair pulled back in an impeccable chignon, deep brown eyes, innate class that showed in every gesture. She wore a designer suit that cost more than Marcus's monthly salary, but there was something in her manner that went beyond luxury, a maternal vulnerability that made her completely human. Victoria thanked him for what he was doing, amazed that he had succeeded where all the doctors had failed. Marcus blushed, explaining that the child only needed someone who would listen without expecting anything in return. Sometimes words come out when you don't feel pressured. Victoria was struck by the wisdom of that simple phrase. This man, without degrees or specializations, had understood her daughter better than all the experts she had consulted. She asked if he would like to have coffee with her to thank him properly. When they met at the cafe downstairs, Victoria discovered a Marcus different from what she had imagined. Without the work uniform, he was even more attractive. But most importantly, he was incredibly cultured. He spoke of literature, poetry, art with a passion that lit up his face. He wasn't the simple man she had imagined, but a complex person with a painful history behind him. Marcus told of having studied literature, of having taught before circumstances forced him to change jobs. His mother had gotten sick with early-onset Alzheimer's when he was 30. He had had to leave school to take care of her. When she died 5 years later, he had been out of the teaching world too long. No school wanted to hire someone with that gap in their resume. It was a life philosophy so different from Victoria's, made of strategic planning and total control. Marcus had learned to flow with events, to find meaning even in defeats. When they returned under the building, Grace was still at the window, seeing the two adults together.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
She smiled and clapped her hands. It was the first time she showed joy for the closeness between her mother and another person. Marcus said Grace was special, had a rare sensitivity that would one day become an extraordinary strength. Victoria felt her eyes moisten, hoping he could continue to be part of their journey. Marcus's confession was unexpected. He needed them, too. He hadn't realized how much he missed having a family, even if just for an hour a day. It was an admission that touched Victoria more deeply than she had imagined. Weeks passed, and the morning routine became sacred for all three. Grace now came down to the courtyard to talk directly with Marcus, laughed at his stories, asked questions, behaved like a normal child again. Victoria often joined them, discovering she awaited those moments with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. Marcus brought small gifts for Grace. Not expensive toys, but treasures found during work. A particularly beautiful pigeon feather, a stone polished by time, a flower picked in the park. Grace treasured every gift as if it were precious, creating a small museum on her nightstand. Victoria realized she was changing too. Her clothes had become more casual, her smile more spontaneous. Her managerial rigidity melted in the presence of this man who had brought light into their lives. One evening, while Grace slept, Victoria went to Marcus in his small apartment to invite him to dinner. The apartment surprised her, small but cozy, full of books on every surface, hand-painted pictures on the walls, plants lovingly tended on windowsills, a feeling of warmth that her luxurious penthouse had never had, despite costing 100 times more. During the dinner, Marcus prepared simple pasta, but cooked with love. He told her the complete truth about his life. After his mother's death, he had fallen into a deep depression that had led him to lose everything: job, home, dignity. For a period, he had even lived on the streets, helped only by volunteer organizations. A nun at the shelter had told him something he had never forgotten. pain can destroy or transform you into someone capable of recognizing pain in others. He had chosen the second option. Victoria listened entranced. This man had lived a fall that would have destroyed anyone, but had emerged stronger, more compassionate, more human. That's why he had immediately understood Grace, because he knew pain. The revelation that changed everything came almost by chance. While Victoria leafed through one of Marcus's books, she found a photo that made her stiffen. It was Marcus, 20 years younger, in suit and tie, receiving an award. On the back, Marcus Washington, Teacher of the Year, National Excellence in Education Award. Victoria recognized the award. Her father had been part of the judging committee years before. Marcus wasn't simply a teacher, but one of the best in America. What she saw now was who he really was. A born educator, someone with the gift of entering children's hearts. Marcus began crying silently, years of pain and regret finally finding release. Victoria hugged him instinctively, and for the first time in months both felt truly at home. Victoria had a proposal. Her pharmaceutical group owned an educational foundation looking for someone to direct programs for children in difficulty. Someone who truly understood what it meant to be hurt and need healing. Marcus couldn't believe she saw him capable of directing a foundation. But Victoria insisted. He was the man who had healed her daughter with the power of words, the most natural educator she had ever met. The rest were just titles on paper. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change their lives forever. 3 months later, Marcus had left the orange uniform to return to elegant clothes, but his eyes maintained the same kindness as always. The Sterling Foundation for Therapeutic Education had become his new world, transformed into a magical place where traumatized children found their voices through stories, games, and genuine love. Grace had become his unofficial little assistant. The child, now completely healed from mutism, helped Marcus with other children, telling her experience and proving it was possible to overcome the deepest traumas. She had grown into a little natural therapist, capable of recognizing pain in other children's eyes and offering the comfort that only those who have suffered can give. Victoria watched this transformation with wonder and gratitude. Her daughter had not only found her voice again, but had discovered her mission, helping others. Marcus had found himself again, returning to being the exceptional educator he had always been at heart. The relationship between Victoria and Marcus had grown slowly, with the delicacy of those who learned that the most beautiful things must be cultivated with patience. There had been no rush, just 2 wounded adults who had learned to heal together while helping a child find her way. The evening Marcus asked her to marry him, Victoria had no doubts. It was in the courtyard where everything had begun, with Grace playing nearby. Not for the romance of the moment, but for the certainty that this man had brought into her life something all the millions in the world could never buy: authentic love. The wedding was simple, celebrated in the same courtyard where Grace had spoken her first word after months of silence. Only the dearest were present: foundation colleagues, children Marcus worked with, rediscovered friends from the teaching world. No ostentation, just genuine love, and the joy of having built something beautiful from the rubble of pain. Grace was the perfect flower girl, radiant in a blue dress she had chosen personally. During the ceremony, she raised her hand and asked to speak. In a clear little voice, she said Marcus had been her heart's daddy for a long time, that Mommy was happier since he was there, and that she too said yes to this marriage. There wasn't a dry eye among those present. Victoria and Marcus looked at each other with tears streaming down their faces, knowing they had just received the most important blessing. 1 year after the wedding, the Sterling Foundation had opened 3 new locations across America, and 1 in London. Marcus had become an international reference point for educational therapy, invited to conferences worldwide to share his method based on authentic listening. Victoria had learned to delegate more in the company, dedicating more and more time to the foundation and family. She had discovered that the greatest success wasn't measured in revenue, but in the light in the eyes of healed children. Grace, now 9 years old, had become a little leader in her school. She helped shyer classmates, organized theater shows, had been elected class representative unanimously. The silent child had become a young woman with a mission, using the power of words to build bridges between people. 5 years after that first meeting in the courtyard, Grace, now 12, took the stage at Columbia University's auditorium to receive the National Award for an essay on therapeutic communication. The title was How I Found My Voice and Learned to Give Voice to Others. When Grace began speaking, her stage presence completely captured the audience. She was no longer the silent child of 5 years before, but a confident young woman with a clear mission and her mother's determination. She told her story with surprising maturity, how 5 years before she couldn't say even one word, how pain had deprived her of the ability to communicate. Then came a man in an orange uniform who collected garbage, but who was really a teacher disguised as a janitor. This man hadn't asked her to speak, hadn't pressured her, hadn't judged her. He had simply begun telling her stories, as if she were the most important person in the world. Grace explained she had learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting pain, but transforming it into something beautiful. Her silence had become her strength. She knew how to recognize when someone needed to be heard, knew how important a kind word was. She concluded saying their foundation had helped over 2,000 children find their voices. But her message was for all children listening. Their voices were precious, their feelings important, and there was always someone willing to listen. The applause that followed lasted 5 minutes. The audience stood up, many cried. All had been touched by the story of this extraordinary family, born from the meeting between deep pain and authentic love. After the ceremony, while returning home, Grace took Victoria and Marcus by the hand. She said she thought the biological father had left to make room for Marcus, and that her silence had served to prepare her to become the voice for all children who can't speak. Victoria and Marcus looked at each other over Grace's head, seeing in each other's eyes the same wonder and gratitude. Their child had transformed a tragedy into a mission, pain into wisdom, silence into a chorus of voices singing hope. That evening, in the courtyard where everything had begun, the three sat under the tree that had witnessed Grace's first smile. The child gathered some fallen leaves and arranged them in a perfect circle, saying that was them, a circle where everyone had their place and all held hands. The silence that fell upon them was no longer that of desperation, but of deep peace. They had learned that sometimes you have to lose your voice to truly understand how precious it is, and that true love is what helps you find it again when you're ready to sing. The story of Grace, Victoria, and Marcus became an example for thousands of families, proof that from the darkest moments can come the brightest lights, and that sometimes angels arrive disguised as ordinary people who carry infinite riches of love and wisdom in their hearts. Hit like if you believe in the healing power of kind words. Comment sharing a moment when someone gave you voice when you couldn't speak. Share to honor those who truly listen. Without judging, subscribe for more stories of families rebuilt through authentic love. Sometimes those who seem to have less have the most to teach. Sometimes the most beautiful family is born when wounded souls decide to heal together. And sometimes just a kind word is enough to restore hope to those who had lost it.